I did passionately believe, I really did passionately believe, that the whole trajectory in China would have to embrace some kind of political participation in decision-making, and I did think that China would have to go through a political transition. I remember I lived in Inner Mongolia in the mid-1990s, and I remember having a massive argument on a train trip from Beijing to Guangzhou that year with a student from Beijing University about how, China, in taking back Hong Kong, had to observe all of the treaty obligations, and we kind of had this massive row, and she just said, let's just talk about something else. So I do remember, kind of those debates. I remember in the 2000s when China underwent one of the great kind of explosions of GDP growth of all time. It quadrupled its economy in in a decade. I mean, incredible. And I remember doing a project for the World Movement for Democracy where I went around about the time of the Beijing Olympics and looked at different places in Xi'an household committees. I looked at democracy supporting projects that the European Union was running, I think in Yunnan. I remember looking near Beijing at some of the projects there for village democracy. And 3 million officials had been appointed through these open elections. Only one party could stand, or non-party members. But I kind of thought, with a rising middle class, with per capita GDP rising, you would have to have reforms that would bring about systems like in the West. So I had that experience, and I remember dealing with democracy activists and seeing, as the person said earlier, how they suffered. I remember looking at some of the activists in Inner Mongolia who'd been banged up very badly. One of my friends, Hava, who ran a bookshop there, kind of promoting pluralism and openness, was put in jail for 15 years. I mean, I know how people have suffered. So I'm not at all denigrating and belittling their incredible courage. And the people that still struggle for this in China, I have nothing but admiration for them. However, this is not about that. It's about us, as the previous speakers have said. It's about how did we do? And actually, there are 4 things that I think would have made any Chinese, official or otherwise, really skeptical of anything Westerners said over the last 30 years. The first is that they would have been really aware of the absolutely awful outcomes of what the West told Russia when the USSR collapsed in 1991. We went with bad faith. We went with bad faith and foisted on them economic and a political model which has resulted with the things we see today. Developmental levels in Russia fell. Male mortality fell. It was a calamity for the economy. It had a huge impact in China. The greatest reason why communism is still a live issue in China is because of what they saw happen in the USSR and learning that what is a worse thing than communism? What comes after it? They saw that. The second is the 2001 terrorist attacks. I was in Beijing serving at the embassy at the time. And I remember from 1 minute we went from telling China about how it had to observe the WTO obligations and it had to, kind of George Bush the Younger was going on all the time about how, China was a human rights. It was massive, massive issues of values. But the moment America was attacked, it suddenly became our ally. And we put, I think, a couple of Uyghur groups, Xinjiang groups, Etim and others, on the terrorist list. I mean, we changed almost overnight. The third was the great economic crisis in 2008, about the time that I was working for the World Movement Democracy in China, going around and looking at potential models. And I remember how the profound impact of not only were we purveyors in the West of really terrible political reform ideas, which would have been a catastrophe if China had listened to us, but we were also lousy capitalists. I mean, if China had adopted some of the capitalist measures that led to 2008 that America and others had, it would have probably fallen by the wayside. The actual result was that it became deeply skeptical. I don't think we would have Xi Jinping and his style of politics if we hadn't had the 2008 great economic crisis. But the final thing is the absolute cavalcade of kind of strange and weird events over the last 10 years in America and Europe and elsewhere that have shown that our political systems do not have things that China can really learn from and know would be functional. I don't think it is that China doesn't want to reform. I'm sure it does want to reform, but we don't have particularly good models. I don't believe that we have any good models anymore. That's why I'm a reformed hypocrite. So, I think that there are two things that I want to say really relevant to the deeper reason why we're in this situation. The first is, and someone alluded to it earlier, particularly about Britain, what do we want? I've just written a history of Britain's relations with China since 1600 to the present day. Great reversal, out in all good bookshops, Yale University Press, advert over. That has, kind of a section on when Britain was most powerful. When was Britain most powerful in China? It was in the late 19th century when the Imperial Maritime Custom ran under Robert Hart, a Ulsterman, a third of the Chinese fiscal system under the Qing government. At that time, Britain had absolute supremacy. We had the world's largest consular system in China. We were building railways. We were building mines. We had something like 70% of all foreign investment in China. We had literally saved the Qing in the Taiping Rebellion by fighting on the side of the imperial troops. We had absolute primacy. We did not, however, ever talk about values. We did not, at the peak of our power, want China to be a power like us. What we wanted, our policy was very, very simple. We wanted China not to be so strong that it would be a threat to us, and we didn't want it to be so weak that it would fall apart. We were driven by self-interest. That has been the historic basis of our relationship. What we don't, what we want, our policy towards China is often what we don't want China to be. It's not what we do want China to be. When we come to the 21st century, we have a kind of really, really obvious strategic choice. And the reason why I think that we are hypocrites is because we need to be very honest about why we have an issue with China being the way it is and functioning the way it is. We acted in bad faith because we engaged from the 1990s onwards and through the World Trade Organization entry and all those things, hedging on a bet that we would end up with a China that looked a bit like us, but was not a problem by being too strong and wouldn't, Lord forbid, fall apart. But the problem is, what we didn't ever expect is a China that would succeed under a very different model. And that's what's happened. We have today this incredible anomaly of a China which is a problem to us, not because it isn't a capitalist. The problem is that it is a capitalist that's better than us. It's a capitalist that practices what Darren Byler, a very good scholar in America on Xinjiang, calls terror capitalism. A capitalism without any labour rights, a capitalism without any restraints. It is a better capitalist than us. Our problem with China is that it is doing the things that we thought we were good at better than us. That is why I think that we are hypocrites. And very finally, all of us here, wherever we're from, just because we're at this university, in this environment, we are children of the Enlightenment, the great Enlightenment values. If you look at the Enlightenment Europeans' values, the kind of ideas about China were really well captured by three great figures, Leibniz, Montesquieu, and Voltaire. And they capture very, very well, 300 years ago, why today we are still so conflicted as Enlightenment Europeans, or people in the Enlightenment culture, wherever we are in the political West, up towards China. They captured, on the one hand, a great idealism towards China. Voltaire wrote in the Encyclopedia about how China was a better system than Britain, Britain than Europeans. It was a kind of ideal Confucian meritocratic system. Montesquieu wrote about how it was despotic, an evil system that couldn't really, kind of deliver anything except terrible outcomes. And Leibniz was the abstainer, a bit like the kind of system tonight. And so this kind of, I think, captures who we are. When we look at China today, we kind of see an entity which antagonizes us fundamentally not because of all of these terrible human rights issues. Yeah, I completely recognize those. For our political elite, it is because China is doing the one thing that we never thought it would do, and we didn't want it to do, and we can't stomach it doing. And that is succeeding under the system it has today.